Many of you have heard of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Bishop Barron says that von Balthasar had a major impact on his life and work. Now, von Balthasar is most famous for writing his book called Dare We Hope. Bishop Barron talks about how there's a reasonable hope that all are saved, and this comes from von Balthasar's book. Bishop Barron in a video said that von Balthasar was heavily influenced by Karl Barth, who is a Protestant Universalist theologian. However, a lot of people try to claim that von Balthasar was not a Universalist. He didn't actually believe that there was a reasonable hope that all are saved. And Taylor Marshall and Tim Gordon have a good discussion on this. I'll link the video down below. And I'm not going to focus on von Balthasar's reasonable hope idea other than to point you to the Syllabus of Errors. It was written by Pope Pius IX in 1864, and he said that it is an error that good hope is at least to be entertained of eternal salvation to all those who are not at all in the true Church of Christ. So basically what he's saying is that there's not hope for salvation for those who are not in the Catholic Church. So that would kind of contradict what von Balthasar says. Now, moving on, there is a book called Meditations on the Tarot, A Journey into Christian Hermeticism. It was written by an anonymous author, and von Balthasar wrote the afterword in the book. Now, on Amazon, on the book review comments, people talk a lot about the occult, and so this is largely tied to the occult. Von Balthasar writing an afterword basically lends credibility because the author was too much of a coward to put his name on it, but von Balthasar was not. People justify von Balthasar writing the afterword by saying, oh, well, he didn't specifically support the tarot cards or whatever, and I said, well, you know, if you're looking at the occult practices, what a Catholic priest should do is say, this is not compatible with Catholicism. If you're Catholic, do not read this book, do not practice anything that's mentioned in this book. So von Balthasar entered the Jesuits in 1929, and in 1950, von Balthasar quit the Jesuits to collaborate with the supposed mystic Adrienne von Speyr. Whether or not she was a mystic, you can determine for yourself. I'm going to read some quotes here from Dr. Ralph Martin's essay, and I would encourage you to read it as well. It's 30 pages long. Now, as for Dr. Ralph Martin, he's a professor at Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit. So Dr. Ralph Martin says that von Balthasar had a close collaboration with von Speyr for 27 years, and he lived under the same roof with her for 15 years. So von Balthasar and von Speyr lived in the same house along with von Speyr's husband. Speyr stated that she was in constant communication with St. Ignatius, a claim that von Balthasar completely accepted. Speyr offered to ask Ignatius questions that von Balthasar wished to submit to him. Speyr reported to Balthasar that St. Ignatius, after meeting St. John the Evangelist in heaven, had become more Johannine in his thinking, and so their community that they were to found together, our child, should be Johannine. Von Balthasar and von Speyr formed a community named after St. John, and apparently von Speyr was getting messages from St. Ignatius of Loyola. That's what she claimed. A major emphasis in their common work was finding a way to introduce into Catholic theology an interpretation of Scripture and doctrine based on Speyr's descent into hell experiences, revelations, and theology that would allow von Balthasar to propose that it is infinitely improbable that any human being will ultimately be able to resist God's salvific grace, which basically led to von Balthasar's, formation of the idea that there was a reasonable hope that all were saved and that hell was empty. On July 11th, 1941, Speyr summoned Balthasar to her office, as he later put it, so that she could show her contempt for me face to face. At first, Speyr will not say anything, knowing that it could cost their friendship, but Balthasar urges her to speak, and she did, quietly, with a kind of ice-cold severity. It is not her voice. Someone else is speaking out of her. A terrifying indictment continues for almost an hour. She says she is like a young mother in a labor ward. Medical students look at her and make cynical, indecent remarks. Her husband hasn't the time. He's busy somewhere else, perhaps with another woman. It seems, as Speyr reports, that St. Ignatius relates to Balthasar in a similarly demeaning manner. In a puzzling account of the obedience dynamics of their relationship, Balthasar reports that Speyr would receive a detailed and complicated penitential program from heaven and would promptly forget it under obedience. Balthasar was then expected to impose it on Speyr under obedience, but if he did not do it exactly right, he was reprimanded. Again, this was done in such an exacting obedience that at times I had to start all over again when through inattention or negligence I had made a mistake. I was treated like a schoolboy by St. Ignatius. I had to learn that one can only command if one is under strict obedience oneself. As part of the program, moreover, it was often necessary for me to turn into sheer authority in my behavior towards Adrienne. So basically, they had obedience to each other. I mean, I don't really understand the obedience dynamic, but having quit the Jesuits, von Balthasar was sort of under obedience to von Speyr. Another example of strange voices. As she recited the Tridentine profession of faith, von Speyr stumbled as she came to the words about the Catholic Church, extra quam est nulla salus, outside of which there is no salvation, and left them out. Her husband, who was there, said he heard the words quite distinctly, but as if spoken by a strange voice. In one of von Speyr's books recounting her visions of the saints, she graded the saints on their quality of prayer. She gave a bad grade to St. Thomas Aquinas. Von Balthasar says, as soon as Adrienne's extraordinary experiences began, my work consisted chiefly in fitting them into the tradition of the Church. Dr. Ralph Martin says, to those who persist in saying that he is only presenting a hope, I would like to say directly again as I did above, this is simply not true. While von Balthasar summarizes what he says most perfectly expresses what he is saying, he suggests that it can be infinitely improbable that there are any ultimately lost, as human freedom that appears to finally reject faith may be outwitted by God. Combined with his sarcastic dismissals of those who hold the traditional view, accusing them of the lack of compassion, it is clear where his sympathies and own beliefs lie. A lot of people try to justify von Balthasar's position of reasonable hope. They try to make excuses for Bishop Barron, and Dr. Ralph Martin says this simply isn't the case. Von Balthasar was named a cardinal by Pope John Paul II in 1988. He died just 2 days before the consistory. Just a few days after his death, Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated the 4 bishops for the SSPX without the permission of Rome. Isn't it quite the contrast that a modernist theologian like von Balthasar, who spent 15 years with this supposed mystic, was named a cardinal, and yet Archbishop Lefebvre had extreme problems with preserving the old Mass? It's almost like the modernists wanted to stomp out Catholic tradition and replace it with a new theology. So using these quotes that I had mentioned in this video, do you think that it's acceptable for von Balthasar's theology to be taught in any seminary? Would you have any concerns with someone attending a seminary where they're teaching this von Balthasar theology? I think that seminaries should instead follow canon law and teach the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. I think before anyone references von Balthasar's theology or any of his quotes, they need to instead address these serious concerns about von Balthasar's life and his theology.